So, good evening, everyone. So delighted to have you here, and welcome to this joint MDV knowledge sharing event on People, Planet, Prosperity Project, mainstreaming nature in policy and investments decision. Integrating natural capital valuation into policy and investment decisions is essential for sustainable development and the long term health of ecosystems. By incorporating natural capital into economic analysis and are considered alongside economic growth, policymakers and businesses can make informed decisions. So tonight's session will share lessons from pilot studies in selected countries across Asia and the Pacific, Africa, and Latin America on developing natural capital approaches to inform policy and investment decisions. So to open this session, may I call on Ms. Karma Yangzum. Karma is the Principal Environment Specialist from the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Partner of the Asian Development Bank. Karma?
Uh, Good evening, everyone. This is the last session for the day in this room. So thank you all for sticking around till the end. We've learned a lot about natural capital accounting, from the different perspectives, different angles. So again, this session is, as Jen had mentioned, is actually sharing lessons from case studies piloting natural capital assessment in a couple of countries across the world. So this is again yet another different angle, but actually showing what is being done in practice. So I'm very happy to welcome you to this session, and I'm actually speaking on behalf of my director, Ms. Yoko Watanabe. She is the director of the Environment Group in ADB, and she couldn't come due to medical reasons. So I'm speaking on her behalf. And as we all know, like over the past couple of years, and as we heard in many sessions yesterday and today here at the COP, that the world is beginning to recognize the critical role that nature plays in providing the resources. And in the context of Asia, that's where ADB works, we have this figure where healthy ecosystems contribute to $18 trillion or 53% of GDP in Asia and the Pacific. And nature positive development could generate over $4 trillion in business and create about 232 million jobs per year by 2030. These are all huge numbers. There's a lot of potential. And building on this increasing realization over the world and on the momentum. So I think some of you know that all the MDBs, you see all the logos here. We came together in 2021 and we signed a statement on nature, people, and planet, where we all committed to do a better job in integrating nature into our policies, investments, and operations in all the MDBs. So therefore, as a follow-up, we are doing a lot of detailed work in trying to understand what are the different kind of issues that needs to be further studied or looked into to facilitate incorporating nature and natural capital into the planning and implementation of investments and policies and the kind of investments that we support in our member countries. So, and I think we've learned in the session earlier today in the morning that natural capital approaches entail diverse disciplines and use science-based methodologies to map and quantify ecosystems and the benefits that they deliver. New data, technologies, computing power, and algorithms are driving scientific breakthroughs in carrying out these valuations. So, and as we also heard earlier today, that it's encouraging that there is a growing interest among governments, particularly in the developing countries, interest to develop approaches and carry out natural capital assessments and draw up natural capital accounts in order to guide the policy decisions and investment decisions that countries make. So there is a project called the Natural Capital Project, where three MDBs, IADB, World Bank, and ADB, are working together with Stanford University. So Stanford University is leading this project, and it is this project is also supported by the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. And as Jen had mentioned, so under this project, there is piloting studies going on in 16 countries across Asia and the Pacific, Latin America, and Africa. And these studies, they include a combination of natural capital assessments, informing specific projects in these countries, and building the capacity of the government stakeholders in this country. So in today's session, a brief overview of the findings from these studies will be presented, the lessons learned from these studies, and with the ultimate goal of scaling up the natural capital accounting approach throughout the world. So the project teams are currently working on developing a standardized framework, training curricula, and customizable tools for global application of natural capital approaches, demonstrating and sharing different pathways for policy and finance interventions. So in the next hour, we will be hearing more about this, and I really look forward to the discussions and invite our participants here to also please feel free to actively engage and ask questions during the Q&A session. So thank you very much.
So many thanks, Karma. Before anything else, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Jennifer Romero Torres. I'm the head of sustainable finance practice team at the Asian Development Bank. So again, welcome to all of you. Now, as mentioned by Karma, this is a cross MDB team along with Stanford University Natural Capital. So our next introductory speaker will be joining us virtually from Palo Alto, USA, Miss Mary Ruckelhaus. She's the executive director of the Natural Capital Project, Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. Mary, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Are we able to actually project Mary on screen?
My video is on. Oh, there we
Yes,
go.
we can now see you, Mary. So the
Okay,
floor is yours.
thank you. And I have a few slides to share. It's nice to see Greg and Martino and probably other colleagues there. I look forward to seeing many of you in person starting on the weekend, but I'm not in Cali yet, unfortunately. So that was a wonderful orientation and um, introduction to this project, and I'll give a little bit more of an overview. Let's see where, okay. Let me see. Tell me if you can see my slides. I just have a few slides to share. Can you see okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Go
great.
ahead.
Please let me know. I can't see you now, so let me know if there's anything I need to change. So, yeah, the essential elements of this People, Planet, and Prosperity projects is at the core of it is this Jeff funded project and the collaboration between NatCap, which is what we call ourselves, the Natural Capital Project, whose hub is at Stanford, and IDB. And then, as was explained, the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank have really become crucial collaborating partners and bringing in countries from their regions. So the whole motivation and inspiration for this project came from the signed agreement that was mentioned, that was put together by many MDBs to start really thinking about how do we implement these approaches. So how do we go from this really compelling concept of biodiversity and natural capital approaches and have them really drive policy decisions and drive new finance. So that's really the motivation for this work. So it's to scale up these approaches that honestly are very well tested and we've been working in the NatCap project for almost 20 years. Our 20-year anniversary is next year, to really drive policy decisions and finance decisions. And it's at this nexus, as you all know, I'm sure you're all working at this nexus of human development and ecosystem and climate goals. And so the approach, as was mentioned, is that we are developing pilot projects in 16 countries around the world and showing how diverse these different entry points in policy or finance can be, so that these approaches get taken up more rapidly across sectors, across governments, across IFIs, international financial institutions. And as was also mentioned, it's a real focus on developing capacity. There's so much knowledge and understanding of ecosystems within countries and within the development banks, and trying to really focus that capacity on how to make this long-term systemic change is a very important shared goal of this project. So we have a real diversity, as I mentioned, of decision context. So where are these countries most interested in integrating nature's values in decisions was the first question we asked each of them, in the governments and the multilateral leaders. And you can see here from this bulleted list that it's very diverse sets of questions and applications for implementing biodiversity values and natural capital values in decisions. And I think you'll hear some of these examples today in the rest of the speakers, but we're putting together, maybe 2/3 of the way through the overall effort for this first round of 15 countries. And we've really learned a lot about how do compensation systems work for communities who are stewarding nature, for example. So the payers pay the providers, and how can nature be integrated into large infrastructure loans and planning, et cetera. You see the diverse list of entry points here. And this shows this initial set of 16 countries. So as was mentioned, each of the development banks, IDB, Asian Development Bank, and World Bank, identified 5 or 6 countries that were ready to engage and had policy windows in a 15-month period where this kind of information could actually inform something that the government and the multilateral partner were planning to do anyway in their country. So that's how these countries were chosen. Some are veterans and have been implementing nature's values in policy for quite a while, and others it's relatively new, and we've really learned a lot from one another through having a nice portfolio of country context to work in. And a common framework that the NatCap project, we always work at the invitation of governments or development banks or both. And the common framework that we bring to each of these engagements is, you can see on the bottom here, we're really taking a landscape scale. Sometimes it's at the national scale, so the whole country. Sometimes it's regional, but always with an eye towards understanding where ecosystems are on the landscape, where the built environment is, and therefore where people are who will benefit from change in the landscape or who may be at harm, increasing risk because of landscape changes, and therefore how can we reduce risk and increase prosperity. So you can see we use a number of different natural capital assessment tools, one of which is a suite of models called INVEST, but there are many others we use. And just to note on the left in that middle panel, that the measure of biodiversity value is actually very diverse. It can be monetary if the policy or finance decisions that you see on the right in that middle panel, if monetary values of nature are needed, we can do that. On the other hand, as many of you probably know, sometimes the metrics of biodiversity value are better quantified as the number of jobs or livelihoods supported, or greenhouse gas currencies, or the number of people removed from poverty or taken out of harm's way. So the currencies of value can be customized depending on the needs for those very diverse policy and finance decisions. And then, of course, what we all are aiming for is this more prosperous and sustainable future. So, one hallmark of each of those 16 pilots is that we have worked in engagement teams with government experts, with local research institutional experts, local communities, and of course, the development bank specialists. And we're thinking very explicitly about three pathways to impact. And one is technical. So that's, how do you do a natural capital assessment? How might you do natural capital accounting if that's going to help you? How can you take in local data, remotely sensed data, and everything in between to really do these assessments or accounting in a very transparent and iterative way? A second pathway to impact is to really then design those natural capital approaches, the assessment or the accounting, really pointing explicitly to what specific policy window is going to be informed through this first iteration of the engagement, or what specific finance opportunity is going to be informed by this assessment. That really helps you design the assessment and accounting itself. You pick which ecosystem services or biodiversity components need valuing and in what currencies of value. And then the final pathway to impact, which is crucial, is capacity development. So that's the only way these processes that we might go through once or twice together. The crucial thing is that they keep going after this 15 or 24-month process so that they continue to iterate over time. And many of the countries like China, Belize, Colombia, others have been doing this for decades now. So they're very experienced, and this ongoing process is actually working. And I just wanted to emphasize on the right here, the green triangles, is that there are many roles that actors play in these engagements that you'll hear more about in just a minute. There are technical roles from governments, MDBs, business and civil society. There's convening, capacity development, and then the science policy engagement itself. So it's a good engagement process that really requires people's time and effort. So the main thing we try to do is make sure that we are supporting work that needs to get done anyway. These are not viewed as external projects. And then I think the most important thing, and this is just last spring at Stanford, just the leaders from these 16 countries and the 3 development banks and the Stanford team. And the sharing, coming together to share lessons of what's working, what am I still struggling with, and where do I need help, has been a crucial step for all of us to keep doing this peer-to-peer learning where the governments and the development bank experts are sharing what they've learned with each other, what's working, what's not working, and then the technical providers and the policy providers can help shape and fill in gaps wherever they're occurring. So I will stop there, and I really appreciate everybody listening and hope that we can continue learning from each other the rest of the afternoon. So thank you.
Many thanks, Mary, for this comprehensive introduction in mainstreaming natural capital approaches in policy and finance, and giving us, an overview of the pathways to impact through engagement process. So now we will go through the presentations, but before I do that, just some housekeeping. Um, Here we have the interpretation if you need. So please, you can have the interpretation in your phone, tablet, or computer. We have the QR code and enter the meeting code MDB22. So you can plug in your headphones and press play and choose the language. Now over to the presentation, or we are now moving to the presentation of the joint MDB pilot studies focusing on the adoption of natural capital approaches in collaboration with Stanford University. May I present the speakers for today's event? First one is Martino Pelli. Martino Pelli is the senior economist of the Economic Research and Development Impact Department of the Asian Development Bank. Martino will present the 5 pilot countries of Armenia, Cook Islands, the PRC, and the Philippines. Also, we have Greg Watson. Greg is the principal specialist for the Natural Capital Lab program of the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Division of the Inter-American Development Bank. Greg will present the pilot countries of Belize, Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, and Uruguay. So may I call in Martino Pelli, please, to present on the 5 pilot countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for braving the evening and staying with us at this time. Can we put up the slides? Next. Okay, thank you. So as said, I'm from the research department of the ADB. Where is the, here, thank you. At ADB. So I thought that instead of having another policy session, I will get into the nitty-gritty of what we actually did in the 5 countries, and I will actually discuss 4 of them since I only have 15 minutes. And I will discuss 2 countries where we worked at the project level and 2 countries where we worked at a higher level, really at the natural capital accounting level for the whole country. So let me start by, oh, the pictures are not coming out. There were supposed to be nice pictures, not just names, but okay. So the goals, how at ADB we approached this project was really to think about how to identify entry points for natural capital approaches across the countries. And this for us, it's from the country partnership strategy, from the country diagnostic, all the way down into the projects and how to improve the way we do cost benefit analysis for our projects. How can we better account for natural capital, and thinking especially about doing it not only in project where we are impacting the environment directly, but also transport project, energy project, and so on. And therefore reflect on how to streamline this procedure within ADB. So let me say a few words on how, okay, some images are coming out, luckily, because I have many in the presentation. So about how we thought about this project. So Stanford has this extremely useful tool that it's Invest that allows to do a spatial representation of key ecosystem indicators and then to transform them into physical accounts, okay? But we are an MDB, we need to put dollar signs on things to get projects to move forward. So the last step is the one where we came in and we helped, is really to move from the physical accounts all the way down to the monetary accounts. And this, in both cases, when we think about a country natural capital accounting system or at the project level to do a better benefit cost analysis. So let me start with the first 2 countries, and in these 2 countries we worked at the level of a project. So the first country I'm going to talk about is the Cook Islands. So in the Cook Islands we focused on the Muri Lagoon. This is one of the principal lagoons on the main island of the Cooks in Rarotonga. And it's a lagoon where water quality is deteriorating and biodiversity is decreasing. There are less species that are found in the lagoon. And ADB is planning to build a wastewater treatment plant to help improve the water quality. So what we did, we started with the Invest model. We used three of the models in Invest: sediment retention, nutrient retention, and flood risk mitigation benefits, in order to model and obtain the biophysical quantities for all the ecosystem services we are interested in. And then we moved on and we did evaluation of the water quality in the lagoon. So we are interested to know how the local value the quality of the water, the biodiversity in the lagoon, and the recreational values of the lagoon. So the last bit, the valuation, it's still ongoing. Actually, we are running a choice modeling, and we have enumerators right now in Rarotonga collecting data. So just to give you an idea of what Invest produce as an output, this is a sediment export map. So you can see the Muri Lagoon is here in this area, and you can see the darker pixel show pixel where you have more sediment that can be dragged down all the way to the lagoon. For the valuation, as I was saying, so some picture come out. We are doing a choice model. So one thing that you have to keep in mind when you do a valuation of ecosystem services, you can't value everything. So you have to decide which ecosystem services you want to focus on. Here we focus on water quality, biodiversity, and the recreation values coming out of the lagoon. And we actually run this as a purely academic paper so that the evaluations we get out could be used in the project, in the wastewater treatment project, but could be also used in other different projects that the government may want to implement. And you can see the choice modeling here. Basically, we interview locals and we show them several cards like this one, where they have different attributes of the ecosystem services we are interested in. So from water quality, for ecological health, for public health, aquatic biodiversity, we have the management practices and the number of tourists. And then we ask people to choose between the status quo or different choices which come with a cost that has to be paid once. And by providing random choices to people, we are able to extrapolate their willingness to pay for the three benefits, ecosystem services. And as I said, I cannot show you results because we are collecting the data right now. So this is what we are doing in the Cook Island. Now, if we move on in the PRC in China, as Mary was saying, China has been doing this for years, so they're very advanced. You probably all know about GEP, the gross ecosystem product that was developed in China. We worked again at a project level, and so this is a project in the South Lonting Lake that you will hear discussed again and again by people from ADB, because it's one of the site from our regional flyway initiative. So because it's a very important site for migratory birds. And so, yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm really disappointed on the quality of the slides that did not come out. So we looked at the South Danting Lake. So it's an extremely important ecosystem in the middle of China. It sustains livelihood of 16 million people, so roughly 20% of the population of Yunnan's province, and it provides regulating and supporting services, soil formation, water purification, flood controls, and drinking and fresh water for agriculture. And it supports migratory water boards, as I was saying, for in the East Asian, Australasian flyway. So after identifying the key ecosystem and the benefits they provide, so as I was saying, the protection of the migratory bird, for fish habitat, protected animals, improving water quality, and recreational benefits, we decided to go in a different way compared to the project I showed before. And we decided to start building an ecosystem value tool for ADB. So we use this project to build a prototype of this tool. So it's a tool that's based on benefit transfer. So for those of you who know, benefit transfer is basically a methodology that uses existing values that are out there. And the advantage of building a tool like this is that it doesn't require costly surveys or collection of primary data, and it can be used much earlier in the lifetime of a project. So when it is actually still possible to affect the design of the project. So we started building a prototype for wetland in the PRC, and we used it to actually get estimate of the value of the ecosystem services that the project is going to touch. And we saw that the biggest values actually came from flood control, climate regulation, and carbon sequestration and oxygen release. And then we were able to use this value and feed them into the computation of the GEP for the region. So these are the two countries in which we have worked at the project level. Now I will move on to the two countries in which we have worked at a higher level. And the first one, and I think it's the one in which we are more advanced, is the Philippines. So in the Philippines, we will have later on a speaker that will tell us more about the history of the Philippines, because the Philippines just in the past May adopted a new legal framework for having a full natural capital account for the country. So what the Philippine government was interested in doing with us was to value and build natural capital accounts for watersheds. And we started working on one single watershed in order to build a blueprint that could then be used and replicated across all the watersheds in the Philippines. So the watershed which was identified is Santo Tomas. A little problem that we figured out a bit too late is that you can see that dark spot up here. This is Pinatubo, which is one of the most active volcanoes in the Philippines. It erupted in 1991 with quite destructive effects. And as a consequence, what you see here, it's all lahar deposits that came from the volcano, which made the valuation a bit more challenging than we thought. So what we decided to do was to divide the watershed in mini sub watersheds, so that we could divide between those that were affected by lahar sediment and those that were not affected. So when we found 3 sub-watersheds that were not affected by lahar sediment, that we could use to build this blueprint to then value and build natural capital accounts for all the other watersheds across the countries. We are still valuing also the lahar ridden watersheds, so that we will be able to provide some advice for the integrated watershed management plan in Santo Tomas. But basically, we, as in the other projects, we still started with an assessment. We're using the INVEST model. We use the sediment retention, seasonal water yield, and carbon storage and sequestration models. These allowed us to obtain the biophysical accounts, and now we are transforming those in order to get monetary accounts. And we are figuring out together with the government. So as Mary was saying, I think one of the big part of all these projects across all the countries was capacity building. And everybody in all the countries is really thirsty for knowledge on how to proceed. And one of the things we are looking at in the Philippines is how to get the best monetary values without going out and collecting new data and avoiding extra cost. The last country I'm going to talk about is Armenia. So in Armenia, we worked on a river basin. Armenia has 6 big river basins, and these 6 river basins have each one river basin management plan. This management plan gets updated every 6 years. So we focused on one, the Ararat River Basin, and we tried, since the management plan is up for renewal this year, we tried to work with the government in order to add one chapter to the river basin management plan dealing with natural capital and nature, because so far the management plan only looked at how to distribute equally the volume of water coming from the river basin without thinking about the value of the water depending on where the water was directed, and without thinking about the value of water for nature. So the work was really aimed at introducing this new chapter in the river management plan. And as I said, the sequence of effect is roughly the same across all the countries in which we have worked. A lot of capacity development, data processing, modeling, that this part was usually covered by the natural capital team at Stanford, and then the economic valuation where we would come in and help. So we are in the process of writing this additional chapter, and in order to have it, we modeled the river basin map. We updated the land use and land cover maps, and we did again a survey in order to get the valuation of the water from the people living in the region. The last country in which we worked is Sri Lanka. I'm not presenting it because it's still very much undergoing. So you will be able to see more information on our website about what we are doing in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Martino, for such a very good presentation. Now we move to the next pilot countries of Belize, Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, and Uruguay. May I call on Greg Watson, please?
I didn't just give you a blank slide. That's not very cool of me. So thanks so much for having me today. I'm Greg Watson. I'm from the IDB. Maybe before I go into this project in particular, I'd like to kind of go way back in time, to like 2012, 2013, to talk about our journey on this topic, right? Back then, when I was a baby biodiversity specialist, is when I first met Mary, and we were working in the Bahamas together. And what the bank was doing was actually working with Stanford to do different economic valuations and different scenarios of use plans for a whole island, the island of Andros, which was trying to develop a full island plan for what was going to be conservation, what would be mixed use, what would be developed, et cetera. And so through that experience of working with Stanford and Nat Cap, one of my mentors of the bank said, you have to continue to work with Mary and Stanford. This is very powerful work. And what was really interesting to me was the link to finance, because by using this kind of valuation, the IDB then had a loan to the Ministry of Public Works of several $100 million to actually implement the plan. And it was a better outcome for all involved in terms of conservation, in terms of economic development, because of the planning that had been done with Stanford. Fast forward a little bit, the bank also has another tool called the Integrated Environmental Economic Model, IEM. It has a website called openiem.org. We use that to actually do the same kind of valuation, but to do predictions based on different environmental actions and different policy actions and different economic actions. And so we started to integrate that into some of our analytical work and running those models, for example, to see if Colombia, one of them was to see if Colombia implemented habitat banking, reforestation work, and carbon taxes, under different scenarios, what would happen? Because that becomes a piece of input for the ministries that are trying to make very important decisions about how activities would move forward. Moving forward from that to kind of the more present day, when we started working with Stanford and talking with Mary about this Jeff project, my obsession, and I think with Mary we had many conversations, is economic valuations are great. We've supported several central banks in creating accounts, but at the same time they need to be used for something. And in a time when money is extremely scarce, when we're trying to create policy coherence in countries to lower that biodiversity financing gap and also to bring in finance through results-based metrics, we want to make sure that we're doing these valuations for a reason rather than to publish them in Nature. And so that's a bit where the genesis of this project came from for us. And that takes us to now. So now at the IDB, this is a slide that basically shows our new institutional strategy was just approved this year. And biodiversity and natural capital are, for the first time, at the heart of our institutional strategies. This is a maximum document approved by our governors for our institution as both a transversal area for mainstreaming, but also a direct area for investment. And so how does this link to basically natural capital valuation? Well, first, we're trying to support nature positive development. So this information is useful for us internally with our teams, but it's super useful in our country strategies and our country dialogues, where we've actually worked with Stanford to provide input based on national priorities as to where certain programming could happen, where nature could have a positive impact in achieving the national goal. And it could even be a national goal of Afro-descendant inclusion, where we're involving them in nature-based solutions and et cetera. So that's a way that we internalize it at the institutional level. And we're doing this through our new biodiversity mainstreaming action plan. It has several metrics, but one of them in particular is around this kind of valuation and using it internally in these country dialogues. And also developing the knowledge agenda, which is also a piece of this. But what I want to really talk about today is the mobilization piece and how do we use this for mobilization. So we have various different tools. We're linking the assessment and economic valuation of ecosystem services and the integration of the values, not only into policy, but investment frameworks, but also looking at how does that link with national taxonomies that ministries of finance are increasingly developing. How do we help countries to create registries of their different projects related to building natural capital and the impacts and what is the value of those impacts? And then how do we even, I'd say, more importantly, make sure that the MRV systems are within the ministries of finance and not necessarily in the ministries of environment that are reporting on this kind of data, because that's the key to bringing in the results-based finance. So for me at the IDB, in this pilot, we basically said all of the countries need to be working not only with the Ministry of Environment, but with the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Planning. And that's where we are today. And so we have pilots in 5 countries, as was mentioned, Belize, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Uruguay. Basically, we've already talked about what some of the standardized outputs are going to be, and we're at different levels with the different countries. But what we've seen has been fascinating. First, Belize. Belize has been working with Stanford in the IDB with this kind of coastal zone management valuation for years. Stanford has amazing publications on this. We've done economic valuations of the Mesoamerican reef and what is the value for coastal protection, for fisheries, for tourism, and non-use values using benefit transfer as well. That then led to insurance products for the Mesoamerican reef. Belize had its blue bond and its debt swap. And so basically with this project, what we said is, Belize, you're doing a lot. You've got a lot of metrics. You've got a lot of data. And what the Belize government said to us is, we really now have too much. We were dispersed in all of our KPIs across all of these different financial products. Constantly we're being come at with different MDBs, different financial actors, with different metrics. Can you do this work with Stanford, with the IDB, to help us basically harmonize and decide what are the most important measurable KPIs from this menu that we have? And then we can have a higher level framework for this nationally, so that when we're going with new products, because one of the benefits of this work is you create the dialogue between the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Finance, and then all of a sudden with the registries and the MRV systems, they're ready to do more innovation. So they said, but then we can make sure we're measuring the right things and measuring the right impacts on people. So that's a bit what we're doing in Belize, and we're working with the Blue Bond Unit, which reports to the Prime Minister, and to the with the Ministry of Environment. Chile is another one of my favorite examples here, and we're going to have an event in the Chile Pavilion later this week about this. In Chile, we had supported the Conservation Trust Fund, and also had started conversations with the government about them creating, when they were starting to create their natural capital committee. And I don't know if anybody here is familiar with what Chile has done, but it's great. Under the president, they brought together the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Economy, and the central bank, plus civil society actors, to create a coordination unit based on natural capital and biodiversity. So within that, they said, okay, we need to start doing pilots that show actual value to different ecosystems and to different populations. So in this pilot, we're actually working with the Natural Capital Committee to look at the Rio Bueno River Basin, and we're identifying the ecosystem services that are flowing to different economic sectors. And then that's going to feed into the new watershed management policy that's being drafted. And then that's linking again to work that we're doing with the Ministry of Finance to create financial instruments around these different values. And so, I don't know, will that be a bond? Will that be a payment for ecosystem services model? Will it be a results-based payment model? We're still in those discussions and looking to see what that might be, but we cannot have financial innovation without these kinds of metrics. Colombia is another interesting example where we had been working for a while previous to this project. It was one of our kind of star examples of the integration in the country strategy early on, where we were saying to the country, what are your priorities? Is it transport? Is it inclusion? And identifying the opportunities. But also, Colombia had approached us from the Department of National Planning, which is very strong in Colombia, because they were really interested with gross ecosystem product. And they said, can you help us basically tropicalize this for a Latin American audience? And so we spent a lot of time working with the ministry to basically bring the GEP model from China and make it relevant to the Colombian context. That then opens a whole host of opportunities to continue to work on looking at, how are protected areas feeding into biodiversity values? How is the energy, agriculture, forest, tourism sectors feeding into our policy and our investment possibilities in these areas? And that's what our pilot is doing there. It's underway right now, and it's working with the National Statistics Office as well as with the National Department of Planning. And so we're not only trying to do it on the planning side, but actually bring it into the statistics and the statistical analysis that the country's doing as a regular set of work. And then Ecuador and Uruguay are basically at an earlier phase. We're starting there. With Ecuador, what we're looking at is trying to bring together the more Western style economic valuation in the Yasuni Reserve, which is a reserve in the Amazon. We've had conversations with indigenous populations who've said, we're really interested in the economic valuation, but we also have cultural and spiritual values to this land. And can we bring the two together into a holistic valuation of what this ecosystem is? And we thought that was really interesting. And so that's some of the work that we're trying to do there in the beginning in Ecuador. And in Uruguay, We're still in the design of the pilot. I think we're going to do something based on marine ecosystems. Um, so my last slide's not showing up either. But uh, what I want to really emphasize, rather than going to details of all of these different models, is that this work is tremendously important, not only internally for us to make the case for why the bank should be doing more biodiversity and getting results like having it in our institutional strategy. And it's because we can say, 12% of the GDP or 12% of the economic output of the region depends on natural capital, right? We can come with those kinds of arguments at the macro level, but also in the day to day of what we do, which is sit down with countries and develop country strategies that will determine their entire lending portfolio for the year or 2 years with the bank, to be able to show why this is important, so that they start taking loans, they take guarantees from us to actually support this agenda, and it's not seen as something that's only in the realm of the environment ministry. So that's an important level at the planning level, besides the individual project level, which I also think is really valuable when we're going into the nitty gritty. And I love your example of the watershed, because we're doing a lake restoration project in Paraguay, where actually that would be really valuable to bring to that project. So just I wanted to take a different tack and talk about the different levels of use here. And thank you so much.
Many thanks, Greg. That's a very good and comprehensive presentation. So now we go into a presentation more in a practical sense. So we're calling on the Philippine experience in the adoption of natural capital accounting. So we have Jem Castillo, who's joining us virtually live from Manila, Philippines. Jem is the National Director of Economy and Environment Group of the Philippines and President of Resource and Environmental Economics Foundation of the Philippines. Can we have Greg online? Thank you. Greg, are you there? Sorry, Jem.
I'm online. Let me know if you can hear me. Uh,
Okay.
do you want me to share a slide or you
Yes,
can
please.
answer?
Thank you.
I can do that. Okay, so let me do that.
Sorry, Jem, we have the slides, so we
Okay,
can
yeah,
project
perfect.
for you.
That's good.
So
Yeah, so go ahead, please. Let me know if you're ready with the slides. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to present. Actually, this is sort of a little detail from what Martino has already presented. We work together with the team of Martino of ADB on this, trying to sort of a pilot watershed accounting of ecosystem services, meaning accounting of ecosystem services in the watershed, because that's a prevailing demand of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, being one of the planning unit under their department, although it's a different planning unit for a Philippine Statistics Authority. So I don't know if I can. I have not seen my slide on screen, or should I?
it's okay, Jem.
Ah, okay.
We
So
can
yeah.
we can see the presentation.
All right. Okay. Thank you. So to the next slide, please. The contents. So this is a presentation. Actually, it's a walkthrough, as Martino said, of what has been going on in the Philippines, starting actually in the 1990s. But after that, I'll be presenting the pilot of ecosystems accounting in the Santo Tomas watershed with just a brief details. And so you will see the next slide. Please go ahead. If so, the history of natural capital accounting in the Philippines actually started way back during the after the Rio Summit on Sustainable Development, and so we started our environment and natural resource accounting in 1990s, and then between 1990 to 2000 we have the U.S. funded project called Environment and Natural Resources Accounting Project, and parallel with that is the Philippine National Statistics Coordination Board project, also on the same level. And in the between 2010 and 2020, we have the piloting of the UNSEA experimental ecosystem accounting system, and also the UNSEA central framework. And after the WAVES, which is actually a World Bank funded project, we have uh, These were followed by other projects like the USAID Sustainable Investments for Biodiversity, Oceans, and Landscapes. And also, there was a growing interest on research and development on ecosystem accounting. So that this was being conducted by the Philippine Council for Agriculture, Resources, and Research and Development. Next slide, please. So you will see here the major projects in the Philippines on natural capital accounting, which was actually initiated during the WAVES project of the World Bank. And this was followed by the project that I mentioned earlier on the CIBOL project of USAID. And there are increasing number of natural capital accounting research and R&D, and then of course this project together with ADB and Stanford on ecosystem services accounting and valuation for critical watersheds. The Philippines has identified 131 critical watersheds, meaning these are watersheds that's feeding into irrigation systems. And so they want an accounting of this and how much is it really contributing to the provision of water and also water quality, and at the same time also uh, uh, addressing sedimentation and erosion. So next slide. So we have actually also, as mentioned by Martino, we in last May 2022 we have actually implemented a law. I mean, it's a law that soon will have its implementing rules and regulations to mainstream natural capital accounting in the entire country. But before that, there was already established NCA roadmap that was done during the waves time. That the Department of Environment is also doing some developing guidelines on how to implement natural capital accounting together with the Philippine Statistics Authority. So the next slide. So now, because watershed is one of the planning unit under the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and so we're trying to figure out what best and how best to introduce ecosystem accounting in the watershed context, of course, with the end in view of defining what would be the most appropriate support to planning for a watershed. And so, in cooperation with Stanford, we are employing the INVEST tools. uh, we prioritized three. One is on sediment delivery ratio model, the seasonal water yield model, and then the carbon storage and sequestration model. But of course, we are not limiting to that. The reason for this is that we're just piloting this and hoping to really scale up to other watersheds. And so we have started developing this and collecting data at the watershed level in cooperation with a research bureau of the Department of Environment called the Ecosystems Research and Development Bureau and the field offices. And so we have come up with initial estimates, at least for one invest module on SDR or the sediment delivery ratio. And so this slide was actually also presented by Martino earlier. We came up with a preliminary estimate of the physical account of avoided erosion and avoided export, as well as sediment deposition and sediment export value for the entire watershed, not yet for the sub-watersheds. There were, as Martino mentioned, three sub-watersheds that we are pilot testing so that it can be relevant for other watersheds in the entire country. So these are I will not be able to elaborate much, but we're mentioning this is one of the outputs that we're also actually training the Ecosystems Research and Development Bureau. And the next slide is also a sort of a attempt at transforming this into a monetary value, at least for the SDR model, and coming up with different scenarios, what if scenarios, and what if this investment in conservation, for instance, for the ecosystem or the land use or land cover open area, but varies because of the different investment opportunities for the government and what would be the impact in terms of the contribution to avoiding erosion or avoiding export. And so the next slide will also gives us as a result of our assessment and also in a result of our discussions with the team that's developing the accounts for the Santo Tomas watershed. And same also is true for the entire country is the issue of capacity in terms of data and analytics challenges. One is the accuracy of data because of the resolution. Some of the data that's available is global. Some of the data that's available is only for specific locations, not necessarily for the site identified. And so there's really challenges in terms of calibration and using real-time data. And also the capacity because the idea in the Philippines is to really expand the number of persons who would be undertaking ecosystem accounting because right now we only have a few. I mean, if we're going to do mainstream this in the entire country, we need a pool of people who can do ecosystem accounting at the site level. We're not just targeting a national level accounting, but we're actually doing planning on site level at the watershed. And also, policy and institutional barriers like different data standards by different agencies. As you know, ecosystem accounting will require multi-disciplinary and also different sources of data. And so the next slide, just for scaling up, we want to expand from the Santo Tomas watershed to other watersheds. And so there's a need really for multi-sector collaboration with local government units being the users of the data as well as civil society organizations and private sector because the land use in the Philippines is defined by different ownerships and property rights. So there are property rights within the LGU, there are property rights with the private sector and also civil society organizations. And so NCA results need to prioritize what are the interventions needed. So is it needed for reforestation or restoration, or is it needed for sediment management? And also to promote nature-based solutions or green infrastructures. So the next slide, we want to integrate ecosystem accounting at the national policy and also in investment framework. And so this linkage with ADB is really very of interest to us because we want to find out if these kinds of work will actually be of interest in terms of investments. So we want mainstreaming NCA in public investments, and so there's a need for us to provide guidelines and ensure, of course, that institutions, especially now that there is a prevailing bill on water department, and so we wanted to make use of this different data that we generate from accounts as to be useful for their use. And of course, the Philippine Ecosystem and Natural Accounting System law, which was just signed in May, will need an implementing rules and regulations. And the Philippine Statistics Authority is asking us for support in terms of what would be the content of the implementing rules and regulations. And so there is really a need for collaboration between the Philippine Statistics Authority and the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. And so for the next steps is for Philippine Statistics Authority, the BNR, the National Economic Development Authority, and the Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources to work together on really putting in place natural capital accounting, not only at the national level, but at the site level as well. I think that will be my last slide. I hope I did it well. I mean, able to complete or able to communicate what I intended to communicate. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Jem. So now we open the floor for Q&A. Okay, perhaps I will ask the first question. And my question is actually to Jem Castillo. Can we still project Jem? Okay. Jem, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, Jem. So just the first question. So the Philippines, as you mentioned, has been working on this for a long time and is ahead of the curve in a way. So other countries in the region have also started working on the national capital, accounting. And for instance, Vietnam is also developing ocean accounts.
Mhm.
The question I have is there any collaboration across countries in Southeast Asia or other regions to ensure that accounts will be comparable?
That's a very good question, and also it's a challenge to us. I am a member of the Economy and Environment Partnership for Southeast Asia, being one of the uh, uh, executive officers, because the partnership is actually consists of five countries: Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and the lower Mekong countries like Laos, PDR, and others. And we have actually set up a collaborative partnership, and we have an existing proposal for actually sort of working group within the ASEAN to really cooperate in terms of natural capital accounting. And so our the Philippines, the Economy and Environment Group Philippines, started that by conducting a training among these different countries of our Economy and Environment Partnership for Southeast Asia, so that we can have a common guidelines and standards. And so that's one of our proposals right now, to come up with a sort of a community of practice. The one in Vietnam is on ocean accounts, focuses on central framework guideline because it's a ocean accounts. Indonesia is also doing that, at least for Malaysia, also focusing on the central framework approach. Indonesia is focusing on carbon, but we want that the really work will expand not only to central framework guidelines but also to ecosystem accounting guidelines. So there's existing and proposed cooperation at this time for ASEAN countries. Thank you.
From the floor, please. Yes, please. Yeah, it's okay because we have interpretation. Or Martina can.
Hola, para WhatsApp. Dijiste que se habían basado con el DNP, ¿no? Para el tema de priorización, pues como del proyecto, y va orientado a áreas protegidas. Pero pues en Colombia las áreas protegidas no han sido pues como tan efectivas en términos de conservación. Por el contrario, nosotros como pueblos indígenas y sobre todo el mecanismo que tenemos nosotros de titulación, que son resguardos indígenas, son 27 millones de hectáreas. Entonces, dirás tú la magnitud y justamente ahí es donde se preserva mucho más el término de biodiversidad. Vimos también que están trabajando en términos de cuencas hidrográficas y por ahí va la pregunta. Em, en la Amazonía colombiana hay diversidad, o mejor dicho, la cantidad de cuencas hidrográficas son increíbles. Incluso en mi comunidad, que es pequeñita, encuentras 12 y es un área pequeña. Entonces, no sé qué criterio hay como tal para abordar la realidad de cada país, porque me llamó mucho la atención que en Ecuador lo hicieron con un enfoque más cultural, mucho más holístico. Entonces, de pronto los proyectos que se orienten, pues, ser o replicarse, sobre todo en los países que compartimos la Amazonía, en un contexto más holístico, en el tema cultural. Tú lo dijiste, el tema de la espiritualidad es uno de los componentes más fuertes que ha permitido que los pueblos indígenas tengamos mucho más fuerte o marcado el tema de la preservación, la conservación, el manejo, uso y la sostenibilidad de los territorios. Entonces, no sé ahí cómo ustedes lo estandarizan o si verifican realmente si una entidad de gobierno sí está haciendo acorde con los aspectos o bueno, la riqueza o la diversidad que tiene cada país. En este caso, DNP, como lo oriento, pues no lo vemos, o personalmente no lo veo que vaya a ser mucho más fuerte en esos términos de impacto.
Wait, can I answer in Spanish? Is that okay? First, before I answer that question, though, I wanted to give a little ad, because on the 30th at 1:20, there's an official side event on the CBD calendar about this topic as well, where we're going to have countries from various regions speaking about their experiences. So I wanted to mention that, and if you're interested in the topic, please come. Pero para contestar a la pregunta, ¿no? varias cosas va a mí, ¿no? Primero, en temas de Amazonas, hemos hecho con nuestro modelo AIM que estuve mencionando una valorización de la región amazónica para ver cuál sería el costo de llegar al tipping point en Amazonas y cuál es el beneficio de evitar llegar a este tipping point, ¿no? Y esto en el sitio de web del BID. Y esto es para traer exactamente lo que usted está diciendo a la conversación con las autoridades y con las inversionistas, ¿no? Porque si no tenemos esta data, es muy difícil de convencer a la gente, ¿no? Así, a nivel de la región tenemos eso. Creo que, y segundo, los diferentes pilotos, todos son pilotos, ¿no? Así estamos experimentando para llegar a tener un marco común que cada país puede aplicar para sus propias condiciones, ¿no? Y por eso las lecciones que vamos a tener de Ecuador puede servir en otros lugares. Y esto es porque tenemos los pilotos del proyecto, ¿no? Y los pilotos son como demand driven, así. Y esto es lo que quería hacer Ecuador, ¿no? Pero creo que vamos a tener lecciones muy interesantes de ese trabajo que puede trasladar a otros países. Tercero, todo eso está muy, muy, muy enfocado en condiciones locales, porque no es posible hacer una valoración a nivel de un estado. Es posible, pero de un país, ¿no? O usar, ok, tenemos esto de este país y voy a trasladarlo a otro. No, no, es que todo es muy local. Así empezamos desde delimitar el área de intervención y de investigación. Así, eh, yo no escojo las áreas, es que estamos trabajando con los clientes, pero otra vez, es un piloto y queremos expandirlo a varios diferentes lugares. Pero sin esta data es muy bien difícil de empezar la conversación. Así, yo espero que esta data puede ser útil para todos nosotros cuando vamos a hablar con las autoridades, cuando vamos a hablar con los que quieren hacer inversión en biodiversidad para traerlos a la mesa.
Gracias.
Any questions? Okay.
Is Mary still there online? Yes. Hi, Mary. Thank you for your presentation earlier. So, since you probably have the bird's eye view of, the project across several countries, across different regions. So, from your observation, just curious to know if you saw any similarities or maybe even differences, which is unique to a specific region or a specific kind of country. So just wanted to learn a little bit more about, your observations from that higher level bird's eye view. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, it's interesting. And this is sort of a function of the countries that were selected by IDB, ADB, and we didn't talk much about the World Bank countries today. But the incredible diversity of ways in which biodiversity affects many sectors and many types of policies and investment instruments is I think very instructive for all of us, because I think the incredible inspiration that came from the MDB joint statement for Glasgow was that these development banks and the member countries feel ready to move into implementation. So, bringing the values of nature into policy, into investment. And because ecosystems and species diversity are so intertwined with our economies and our cultures and our societies, there are many examples that you can draw when you work with a government or you work with a development bank on how does nature's value really get taken up to change the way I'm doing things now? And I think some of the cross-cutting lessons we're seeing is, as Greg mentioned, working with finance ministers, central banks, or planning departments is really important because they tend to be the synthesizers. They tend to look at a whole economy, a whole set of governance policies, and think about where we maybe have some lack of coherence, where might we have subsidies that are harmful, where can we get efficiency. So it's interesting that in many cases, incorporating these nature's values into the decisions makes a more efficient policy or a more efficient investment outcome. And that's what we want to show the rest of the world, is that these approaches are actually better for humans, better for the planet overall, of course, better for ecosystems, but they really do bring more efficient solutions for finding coherent policies across ministries that might not talk to one another. So, for example, Greg briefly went over the Belize case, the development along the coastline for tourism, and this is very similar to Cook Islands and Philippines, is very important to support the tourism revenues that come into those countries. And you can say very explicitly, based on these models of biophysical value that mangroves or coral reefs or other habitats bring to protecting shorelines from erosion or flooding, and also supporting fisheries and artisanal livelihoods and tourism. So you can find really interesting solutions for future development, where development, of course, has to happen for economies to prosper. But you can say very explicitly with these valuation methods, where is it okay to develop because you're not going to harm these other sectors like tourism, uh, safety, food production, and fisheries, for example. So that's a very common message that we're seeing in watershed planning. So on the upland freshwater systems as well as in the coasts. And I hope together we can just collect more of these stories so that people don't think of biodiversity as an afterthought for climate resilience or other things that feel more pressing, is that it's actually a necessary part of the solution for economic recovery and other goals. So I've been very encouraged by that general result. So it's not either or, is it development or is it protection of biodiversity? It's more of a yes and let's do both, and it will help this long-term prosperity that we're all trying to seek.
Thanks, Mary. Now, I have a question for Martino and also for Greg. Given that you've been working directly with these countries and doing the pilots, so how would you incentivize other countries to follow suit? To start doing the valuation and report, their the nature valuation into their not national accounting system. And also, what are some of the key takeaways, and what's the work going forward after the pilot? Martina?
So I think that, as Greg was saying, and from the ADB standpoint, I think with the exception of the Philippine and PRC, countries are still at the beginning of the process, but we need to really get them to know what it means and to get to the point where we can talk to the Ministry of Finance and show the advantages of having these numbers, whether it's to show, if you have a good natural capital accounting system in place, you can see the evolution on, for instance, of public goods, and you can discuss more concessionary finance from MDBs. You can negotiate better deals even with the private investors So this is the way forward. And as I was saying, in these countries that are starting, like the Cook Islands, like Armenia, there is an exceptional thirst for knowledge and for learning how to get active in this process.
And I'm going to be brief because I know it's late, but for me, I think we need to use our comparative advantages, right? I mean, working at an MDB, our governors are ministers of finance, right? That's who sits at our board. That's who we talk to all the time. And so we have a natural relationship there. But as MDBs, we also work with the ministries of environment. We also work with the ministries of planning. We even, we work with the Ministry of Public Works. So we internally need to leverage all of our internal tools to bring that conversation to the ministries of finance, and not only because and to show how it brings value into the country, both in terms of jobs and in terms of social well-being, but also in terms of investment, because you can't attract the investment unless you can show the results and the metrics. And what people want to understand is what they're getting for their investment. So for me, that's super important. And then in the region, we're fortunate. We have a coalition of finance ministers for climate action that the IDB is the secretariat for, and they've just recently decided to create a sub-working group specifically on biodiversity. And the leaders of that group are going to be a couple of countries that we've talked about today. I don't want to scoop their announcement, but it's because they see the value, and they see that from the ministers of finance that there's both risk and opportunity in ignoring the value of biodiversity. So I think that's a super positive development, and I hope it happens in other regions too.
All right. So now we go to closing remarks. We have two distinguished guests as well who would provide some keynote closing remarks. First, we have Ms. Naoki Ishii. Ms. Ishii is the former CEO of the Global Environment Facility and a professor at Tokyo University. Naoki-san?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this very interesting session. I have been long waiting for an opportunity to learn more about this nut cap project and then how 3 MDBs are doing. So that to me, it's a golden opportunity to really learn in 1 hour. So thank you so much. While I was at the GF, that we subscribed to this planetary boundary concept. And according to that concept, that we are now breaching 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries. It's basically telling us we are facing not only climate crisis, but we are facing that natural crisis, a nature crisis. And it's also telling us that in order for us to really turn this trend around or the back, we have to really shift our economic system, because the reason why we are bleaching that the 6 out of 9 planetary boundary is our current economic system is really undermining this natural system or planetary system. So in order for us to arrest it, we have to really take a look at where we can really shift our economic system. Now, to me, the answer is to put a valuation of the natural capital, or to really account for the real value of natural capital. And while I'm talking about real value, I'm not just thinking about, of course, not about physical account, but also not just the monetary account. It has to be taken into the decision making of the entire economic actors. So how can we really turn the natural capital as an investable asset, a new asset class, and hopefully then bring it to the balance sheet, not only national balance sheet, national account, but also the company's account. So to me, if we are able to actually extend what we are talking about to that level, I think we can really turn around that this an ongoing crisis of our economic system continuously destroying our foundation. It's a natural system. So that's why I was really interested in to run NatCap project and what the MDBs are doing. And we learn a lot. I personally learn so much, and that's so great stories. But the question for you all is, how can we further extend your pathway to put the natural capital, monetize the natural capital on the balance sheet of the both nation and the companies? If we were able to do it, that many of the debt crisis, the countries will their rating will be upgraded because if we are able to take into account those natural system, and if the countries are not destroying the forest and if they put in a real value, the rating should be much better. So some of them are able to get out of this debt crisis. So that's one. On the private sector side, I saw so many companies that including Japanese one, like the paper companies, the forest companies, they are doing actually safeguarding not only productive forest but also protective forest. It's more like a standing trees. But on their book, those standing trees are not protective forest has absolutely no value. So that if they are able to put that monetization, monetary value of those standing forest, there must be much more incentive to get funding for those activities, and it will actually help that if we are able to shift this system to that. Who are the really beneficiary of this new system? It's going to be indigenous people, local communities, smallholder farmers, and fishery communities, because they are doing this safeguarding natural capital without even being recognized. So that if we were able to shift it, that then it will actually solve a lot of issues, not entirely, but address a lot of issues this north-south distrust of the current economic system is having. So that would be my hope. And but to do that, my last kind of going forward, we have to think that then how to shift this entire market, capital market or financial market ecosystem, including accounting system, the regulation, that the credit rating system, and of course MRB system. If we were able to bring those ecosystems together to shift to truly account for the true value of the natural capital, that will really, really solve this crisis we are facing. And I hope that then we can learn more from what you have been doing and how to extend it to put the natural capital on the balance sheet project. So that will be my hope that then you continue to work on that and that let's solve that crisis we are facing.
Thank you, Naoki-san, for such a very insightful remark. Now we move to our next distinguished guest, Mr. Eli Fenichel. Eli is actually the Knobloch Family Professor of the Natural Resources Economics at the Yale School University. Eli?
Thank you very much. I've been involved with natural capital accounting for many years, and worn many different hats in so doing. So what I want to start off by saying is it's like so wonderful to be in an event and see all like this progress and what I would say is like success and optimism that Greg and Martino were showing us, and Mary. I think one of the first things that I often think about, and I think this was coming through, but not quite said explicitly, was that natural capital matters because it has effects on other measurements. And it actually leads some really important economic statistics and economic measurements to likely be mismeasured. We're starting to see evidence of that. And so there's just room to improve run of the mill standard economic and fiscal management by bringing in this information. Um, a key component to this success, and I think we're starting to see some of this success, is to actually understand the fiscal institutions and then how to improve them. And it sounds like this is what these projects are working at by working with finance ministers and whatnot. One of the faults that we made early on is we assume the way these things work from textbooks or whatnot, rather than getting into the weeds and actually understanding how they work. So we need to be very careful to go in and understand how they work so we can improve them. Um, One of the key things that we need to do is think about frameworks that aggregate up, right? That are nested, because what needs to be measured, what matters, is different in different places, but ultimately can be aggregated up into somewhat common frameworks. And we see this in standard economics. Like not every country has like a robust auto industry, but it does have a manufacturing. It might have a manufacturing sector, and these things nest up. And this is really important because when we talk about nature, or particularly biodiversity, we can't start by measuring the physical quantities and then doing the valuation. So we recently published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that lays out exactly why that is and why we need to start with those fundamental units and then aggregate in the monetary terms if we're going to aggregate up into these larger sectors. This is really important, and it looks like the framework's being laid to do that. Um, so one of the other things I want to say is we often hear about the challenges, and I will say many countries do things like measure the value of owner-occupied housing, and what we're talking about doing actually isn't that much harder than doing that. It's in the same category of how do you value like improvements in computing technology. So like we don't have a problem doing that. Nobody balks at doing that. We can do that with a lot of natural resources. Not everything, but we can start. And this goes to the improving data resolution. And then we have to think about the updates and how frequently different things need to be updated. When you understand how economic statistics are worked, some things are updated every 5 years, some things are updated annually, some things are updated daily, right? And we need to understand like what the right timescales are for nature too, so it can feed into this system. Another challenge that we often hear is we don't always distinguish the difference between value and pricing. And value is really important for project management and sort of the value proposition of a specific project. Prices are really important for macroeconomic planning because macroeconomics really doesn't deal with value, it deals with prices and quantities. Um, One of the things then we get confused about that I don't hear enough people talking about is, well, first off, I think pricing is easier, which is good for macroeconomics. But when you don't have functioning markets, which is what we're talking about with nature very often, there's a gap between the buy price and the sell price. And there's often arguments over which price you're supposed to use. And so this goes back to some of the points that Martino and Greg were making, that you actually have to know what the question you're answering is. And maybe you need like multiple, you need like buy price, sell price columns in your accounting structures. Um, so the key is that the challenge for project planning is really about managing risk, and we often think of this, particularly in some frameworks. We can think about this in terms of improving well-being, and we need to ask: is the question about improving well-being and welfare of people, or is it about fiscal management? Because the boundaries and what matters is going to be slightly different, but nature still matters in both of these questions. Um, this comes to when we think about particularly the welfare side of this. Um, it's very important in often regulatory frameworks. It's important in the UK, it's important in the US. Many other countries use sort of these welfare standards to figure out what's a good decision for people. And then they have to solve the fiscal management problem. One of the things that's actually really interesting is I hear a lot of conversations about benefit sharing. And one of the interesting questions is, what's the vehicle for benefit sharing? And does that put us back into a fiscal question or not? And I think this is an uncomfortable conversation that sometimes we have to have, because if we're going to talk about benefit sharing, we have to understand the vehicles for benefit sharing, because I can't share my happiness and joy in nature as much as I want to. I can tell you about it, but I can't, like, I need to fork over money if I'm going to like share, like somehow redistribute that or something else. Right. I think it's great. I mean, Greg, you're singing from like what I always preach, which is like, you got to involve the ministries of finance, central banks, planning ministries. And these people are interested, but they can't be overwhelmed. One of the places where I can see this going, and I think is really important, and when I was at the White House, we talked about this a fair bit, is how do these things actually factor into budget projection processes in the macroeconomic planning, right? Because at the end of the day, most politicians want to know, like, do we have enough tax revenue to cover the programs we want to do, right? That are going to get us votes. And so the question then becomes like, how do we project budgets, and can we do a better job projecting budgets if we bring in nature? And the answer is probably yes, especially as we think about adapting to climate change and dealing with like all of the shocks that countries that face with increased storms, flooding, forest fires, all of the events we're seeing. We need to be able to plan for those better. That means bringing nature into the budget forecasting process. And I'd love to hear at some point if these are conversations are happening, and learn from them. I was also one of the, and so I was also one of the authors, co-authors for the first chapter of the new Changing Wealth of Nations report, which is really exciting and worth looking at. And I think one of the things that I learned through working with the World Bank on that, and I don't speak for the World Bank, but one of the things I learned was that like the data that our colleague from the Philippines was talking about is actually better than the data that the World Bank tends to use, because it's using global data sets and not country specific generated data. And so one of the things that like we would lament about is we need something like Penn World Tables for nature, where we're actually organizing all of the cool country data, even though it's not all going to align, but start organizing that. And I think the Penn World Tables really helped us understand macroeconomic better because it organized country level data, not just sort of global data sets. And so, and why does that matter at the end of the day? Well, I was thinking of a study that was done at the OECD looking at like why does nature matter in the environment, and what they're looking at is something called total factor productivity. And total factor productivity like really sits at the heart of a lot of economic policy. It has to do with like how much is a economy innovating is what it's supposed to be, but it's probably mismeasured because nature's hopefully loading into TFP. Otherwise, it's really distorting other measurements throughout the economy. Well, the OECD did a study using older World Bank data, not the most recent Changing Wealth of Nations, and we're like, yeah, it affects it, but not very much. But like those data aren't very good and not very representative, and sort of hodgepodge together in the first place, and probably wiped out the TFP measurement they were getting at. And I think if we can start understanding the role of nature and things like total factor productivity, like every finance minister is going to care a lot because that is what drives labor policy, it drives industrial policies, and drives financing. So I think there's a lot here, and it's wonderful to see the progress that's going on, and I hope it continues.
So thank you so much. I know it's late. We really appreciate your participation. And so we conclude the session. Thank you very much. And thank you to all our distinguished presenters and guests. Thank you.